I mentioned in session 1, the mobile landscape, the problems of the business problems and the problems of regulators. So we're just going to briefly look at some of the issues around permissions and regulating in mobile. It might not be the first thing you think of when you're talking about mobile marketing, but for many brands it is absolutely fundamental, and it's certainly important to consumers. So essentially we have the regulatory side of it, the legislative things, the things you must do, and then on the other side you have the voluntary part of it, so the best practice. This is probably the best way to understand it. To what extent do we have a problem with spam in mobile? Well, actually the DMA decided to find out, and what we found is that 58% of consumers, when we studied them, said that they had received some kind of spam, some kind of unsolicited message from a brand. Interestingly, over a fifth of that was consumers who had already engaged with that brand. So legally they were opted in, but for the consumer, that was still spam. And interestingly, 18% of people had 10 or more unsolicited messages during just 1 month. So clearly there is a problem, and if brands want to engage through mobile, you need to understand what's going on. Now this is the spam spectrum. This kind of represents really the range of permissions and spam. So at the one end you get the malicious stuff. It is relatively small compared to things like the online channels, but nonetheless they exist. And these are the kind of malicious attempts to gain money out of people. And these are typically dealt with by the Office of Fair Trading and PhonePayPlus, but it's also a criminal activity, so very often the police and the courts get involved. And that, even though that represents a small portion, getting to a bigger proportion of the unsolicited ones. The things you didn't ask for, they're trying to solicit for a legitimate purpose, but the way in which they're doing it is illegal. And in the UK, we've seen a spate of things around accident claims and debt management and so on. And this is something that's being looked into by the Information Commissioner's Office, but also because they're regulated by the Ministry of Justice, they're also getting involved with that. Then you've got things where perhaps you opted in, but they haven't actually done it properly, so you haven't given proper terms and conditions, you haven't identified the brand when you sent the message. And these will typically be dealt with by the ICO. And then you get the conditional things. So, for example, marketing to children, marketing of alcohol, gaming, prize draws, and so on. So people might have opted in, but they've not actually followed some of those conditions. And again, these tend to be regulated largely by the ASA, Advertising Standards Authority, but also by the Office of Fair Trading. And then you have the opt-in but unexpected. So a consumer has opted in through the course of a sale or negotiation of a sale. They've been given a set of terms and conditions, but they're not expecting to see that text. Sometimes the data's old, they collected it some years ago. Sometimes they haven't been very clear about the T's and C's about how you actually opt out. More often than not, that's dealt with by the brand, but the Information Commissioner's Office may get involved. And then at the far end of this, you have best practice. So this is the thing where you get permissions and people are properly engaged. From a legal perspective, everything up to here is considered spam. But from a consumer perspective, it's here. So it's really important that brands understand the need to use best practice in their marketing. Here's an example. This is actually a message I received. Good morning, Mark. Your T-Mobile upgrade, and so on. So what's wrong with this? Why would this be considered spam by a consumer? Well, first and foremost, it's clumsy marketing. What's the first question that people ask? How did they get my number? And I did wonder how they got my number. I then looked back in my records and saw that I'd actually bought a mobile phone. I was referred to them through my mobile operator, and I'd bought a phone from this company. So they'd certainly had my opt-in, but that phone I'd bought was over a year ago. I'd forgotten about them, I'd forgotten about the company. So to send me a message like that is extremely surprising. So how did they get it? Well, I checked through their T's and C's, and in fact it does say in their terms and conditions that they may send me more marketing messages. But they didn't give me the opportunity to opt out at that point. And although they gave it to me later, it says T's and C's applies at the bottom of that message. Nonetheless, from a consumer's perspective, it's still spam. So I wasn't expecting to get that message. And the other thing that surprised me about this is "Good morning, Mark." Now, this is an attempt at personalisation. Now, as I often say, this is not personalisation. The BMW example that I gave, that is personalisation. This is just simply a mail merge. So when you're actually working with people on their mobile phones, we are talking about a very personal channel, and it's important to get that engagement right. Just a quick run through some of the main regulatory bodies that are involved in the UK. So we have PhonePayPlus, or PPP. And these people regulate only premium rate services. So, for example, in mobile, it is primarily short codes. So these are the 4, 5, or 6-digit numbers. Now, a short code does not necessarily mean you're going to be charged, but many consumers believe they do. But where there is a charge made, they are involved with that. And they do have some increasingly large powers with which to fine people, but also shut down services that are clearly malicious. And they've done a very good job in removing a lot of the malicious texting that has been going on. The ICO is primarily concerned with the privacy side of things, so it's data protection, and most importantly, from the point of view of mobile marketing, the Privacy and Electronic Communications Directive, or PCR, as it's often called. And that's the thing that basically says you need to get an opt-in before you send people's messages. And you need to offer them an opt-out if they don't want it anymore, and you need to identify who you are. Now, for the purposes of the directive, SMS and MMS, and in fact any other type of messaging, comes under the electronic mail category. So essentially it's the same as email, except I think we can safely assume when it comes to mobile that all messages are personal. The other thing about the PCR is it was updated in 2011 to include cookies. And that legislation basically says that they must get consent in order to drop some kind of tracking information on the device. Now, it's important to understand with the cookies part of the directive is it doesn't just apply to cookies on the web. It is agnostic both in terms of the technology itself and the device that it's on. So it doesn't matter whether it's a PC, whether it's a mobile device or a tablet device. The legislation is all the same. So, for example, if you're going to use a unique URL or a PURL, personal URL, in a text message, that will be counted as tracking in terms of the regulations, and you need to seek permission. Now, there are a number of ways you can do that, and at the moment, that is actually under review, under guidance, but as of 2012, as of May 2012, the ICO will be enforcing these regulations. There are a number of guidelines that you can read for that, and there is a white paper from the DMA that explains exactly how cookies and other tracking information works in mobile and how to do it and remain within regulations. The Mobile Marketing Association is actually a global body which has a lot of information around things like codes of conduct, consumer best practice, and advertising guidelines. The DMA very much focuses on best practice, and the DMA's mobile best practice is pretty much a handbook of how to do mobile and not annoy people. And I've just mentioned there are specific white papers on things, so there's one on cookies that is now available for people to use. The MDA, the Mobile Data Association, has been collecting a lot of information about use around mobile, particularly SMS, MMS, and the mobile web. And then the IAB, who are a very dynamic body, who are particularly focused on advertising, but have produced some excellent studies, some excellent reports into mobile and uses around advertising, spend, and even things like messaging and response to messaging. The ASA is less of an advisory body, but these people regulate what goes on in mobile. And as with the PCR, they are device and technology agnostic. So a few years ago, the information on a website on a brand website came under the same regulations as television and print advertising and so on. So similarly, brand information in apps or on the mobile web is covered by the ASA's code in exactly the same way. So, to finish on this, testing your understanding, choose one brand and describe how mobile can be used to improve the customer experience across the range of its activities, and think of a plan for how you can implement its brand into direct and other relevant activities.